This video will be looking at cell membrane structure and molecular transport, mostly at the structure of the membrane. So there's a picture of the cell membrane, all of its different parts. We're going to be looking at all of those in turn. Most importantly, the cell membrane is made up of these little structures. This here on the right is more of a molecular rendition of these little guys here, which I usually just draw look like this. Which these are called phospholipids. The reason they're called that is because they're made up of two parts. They have this part up at the top, the head, that contains a phosphate group, and they are hydrophilic. Hydrophilic means they love water. And the bottom portion contains two fatty acid chains, or two lipids, so hence phospholipid, and they are extremely hydrophobic. And so what we call these molecules that have both a hydrophilic and a hydrophobic portion are amphipathic. Amphi meaning both, like an amphibian, both land and water. Amphipathic means that part of them likes water, the other part does not. And so in the cell, because of this, they are organized like this, so that the inside and the outside of the cell, which contain water, have the hydrophilic heads pointing toward them, and the middle portion of the cell, which are the cell membrane, which is hydrophobic, is facing each other. And so this creates a barrier, a semi-permeable barrier from the outside. There are things that can penetrate that barrier. One of those items that penetrates that barrier is proteins. And because some of them, as you can see, go all the way through the membrane, they too are amphipathic. They have parts that are hydrophobic, parts that are hydrophilic. Their amino acid makeup will determine that, of course, as we've talked about already. Some of these proteins, as you can see, like this one that goes all the way through the cell membrane, they are known as integral because they go through the entire bilayer. I didn't mention that. Sometimes this cell membrane is called a phospholipid bilayer. You'll see that a lot because it's two layers of phospholipids. And then some of the proteins, like you see this one here, for instance, these are called peripheral proteins. They do not go all the way through, but they're on the periphery, on one side of that. The integral proteins mostly act as like transport of molecules to and from the outside, and the peripheral proteins act as like attachment sites for the extracellular matrix and other sorts of communication. So here you can see the same picture of the membrane, or this protein's going all the way through. This business out here is the extracellular matrix. In here you have the cytoskeleton, and so the two bits are connected by some of these peripheral proteins and these integral proteins. On a whole, membrane proteins have one of 6 functions. They can be transport proteins. They can transport materials in and out of the cell. The proteins themselves are usually specific, meaning this particular protein only allows the passage of blue dots, and it acts like a tube. It's like just a tunnel. Whereas this protein requires energy, that ATP, and it opens and closes to allow red dots in, whatever those red dots are. You get the idea. The next activity is an enzymatic activity. They act as enzymes, meaning whereas an enzyme is a molecule that catalyzes a chemical reaction, the proteins on the membrane actually will catalyze some sort of metabolic process, some sort of pathway, which we'll be talking about in later units. They can function as signal transduction. The best way to think about signal transduction is they receive a signal and then they somehow transmit that signal, transform it into another form, very similar to someone calling me on the phone in my classroom and asking me to communicate a message to the student. I did not, they didn't speak directly to that student, but I was their receptor, and then I changed that message so that the student could understand it. That protein acts as a receptor and a transducer of that message. Three more functions. Cell-to-cell recognition. Um, there are pieces of some proteins, this little glycoprotein here. There's a protein with sugars on it. It's a way for cells to recognize each other. Typically, cells want to know, is this us? Is this something else that's not us? It's like an immune function. So that can be an important function of cells. Intercellular joining, literally stitching cells together so that they stay attached. So these are just a connection point. They're not communicating necessarily, but they're physically stitching the two cells together. And then here you can see the attachment to the cytoskeleton extracellular matrix we talked about earlier. This is part of the cytoskeleton. This is part of the ECM. And this protein acts as a conduit for them, a way for them to communicate with each other. Another important part of the cell membrane, which we've mentioned in a other video, is cholesterol. Cholesterol keeps cell membranes flexible to some degree. It also keeps the cell membrane of plant cells from freezing in very cold temperatures, like plants that live in the tundra. And so cholesterol has an important function. There are other functions of cholesterol that will just be keeping this to the flexibility of the cell membrane. And oftentimes you will see the cell membrane referred to as the fluid mosaic model, which is a way of describing it. A model, of course, is just a way to represent something. Fluid, meaning that it's constantly moving. It's a mosaic, meaning it's made up of many different things. And so we've talked about the things that the cell membrane is made out of: phospholipids, proteins, all these different items. And they're fluid. They're constantly moving around. You see this picture here shows that these two, or any two for that matter, will switch laterally 10 to the 7th times per second. That's a lot. That's really fast. Whereas they may flip-flop top to bottom once per month. The idea is that this membrane is not a static picture like you see in a textbook like these, but it is a fluid representation of what's going on. Now, when we begin talking about molecular transport in the next video, I think it's important for us to kind of rehash this idea of cell surface area to volume, and cell surface area versus the size of the cell, how efficient those cells can be. Again, the cell's volume increases at a much more rapid rate than its surface area. So as the cell grows, the surface area is unable to keep up with the volume. And so cells, to alleviate this problem, will divide, causing more of the membrane to be in contact with the outside world, allowing much more efficiency, nutrient transport in, waste transport out, and so forth. Many of the cell or the body's systems mimic this. A great example, of course, is the small intestines with its large amount of surface area in order to obtain nutrients into the bloodstream. So you can see these little folds here on the surface of the cell, or the small intestine, and even the folds have these tiny little folds at the cellular level. And so tons of surface area for nutrient transport. The same with the kidney, with all the tubes running in and out of the blood vessels here, as you can see that. So for surface area, a lot of surface area to be able to do the work that the kidney does, allows the kidney to operate much more efficiently.